Howdy, and welcome to Respiratory System 1, an introduction. So if we just look at sort of an overview of the general gross anatomy of the respiratory system, you can see the cartoon starts with the nasal cavity. Air flows through the pharynx, aka the throat, the larynx, aka the voice box, into the trachea, and then down into the lungs, where the trachea branches into a right and left bronchus, and those bronchi branch and branch until they get down into really small diameter bronchioles, and then the bronchioles end in an alveolar sac, which is, I'm going to show you on the next cartoon. So you can see in this cartoon there's capillaries and some tubes. If you find where it says terminal bronchiole, that is the end of the bronchial tree that began as a branch off the trachea as a bronchus, and as the bronchi got smaller and smaller diameters, finally ended up deep into the lungs at the level of the terminal bronchiole, which is shown in the cartoon on the right. And then you can see the terminal bronchiole. It doesn't show in this cartoon, but it morphs into something called a respiratory bronchiole. In the respiratory bronchiole, that's where you have these outpouchings of alveoli. And the alveoli are covered by capillaries, and you can see there's a branch from the pulmonary artery carrying oxygen, poor CO2-rich blood, so it's blue. Oxygen and CO2 are exchanged between the alveolar capillaries and the alveoli. Oxygen is moving into the capillaries, CO2 is moving out of the capillaries. And then you can see when blood is returned to the pulmonary veins, it's red, so that means it's oxygen rich and CO2 poor. So if you look at this cartoon on the right hand side, if we start at the top, you see a big blue arrow going in, a big blue arrow going out. That's oxygen coming in and CO2 going out. And it shows just below the arrows the alveolar space, and then there's some cells. Those are the alveolar cells right next to the alveolar capillaries. So you can see oxygen is moving from the alveolar space across the alveolar cells into the alveolar capillaries, and CO2 is moving from the alveolar capillaries across the alveolar cells and into the alveolar spaces. And then the blood travels throughout the vascular tree, specifically the arterial tree. The arterial side takes oxygen-rich blood to the tissue capillaries, where it's the oxygen and CO2 are exchanged with the tissue cells. So in the transport of oxygen and CO2, about 98% of oxygen is transported linked to the hemoglobin molecule that lives inside red blood cells. About 2% of oxygen is dissolved in blood. About 90% of the carbon dioxide, while it's traveling throughout the vascular tree, is in the form of this chemical equation. So if this is your new best friend, you should memorize it, soak it in, drink it in, and know how it works. So it's a chemical formula. It's got arrows going either way, so that means if you put one of the components into the formula, then for instance if you hold your breath and and you hold on to your CO2, CO2 rises in the blood, so that pushes the arrows to, or the equation goes to the right. If you eat a bunch of Tums, so you take a bunch of bicarb, that's HCO3-. If you increase that component in this chemistry, then the reaction will be driven to the left. So in other words, chemistry moves in both directions. The equation itself is trying to move to equilibrium, but in physiology it's never going to achieve equilibrium until you're dead. About 5% of your carbon dioxide is linked to the protein called globin in your hemoglobin molecule, and also plasma proteins like albumin can also transport carbon dioxide. And then about 5% of the carbon dioxide travels dissolved in your blood. Like about 2%, remember 2% of oxygen travels dissolved in your blood, about 5% of carbon dioxide does that. So now here's a cartoon again, only it's got more information. So if you see on the right and left sides of the cartoons, you've got a bunch of numbers. Those are partial pressures of the different gases, and they're measured in millimeters of mercury. So for instance, in inhaled air, if you look at the top of the cartoon on the left side, you've got about, in atmospheric air, you've got about 160 millimeters of mercury of pressure for oxygen, and about 0.2 millimeters of mercury pressure of carbon dioxide in inhaled air. And then if you look at exhaled air, it's different. But the point is, inhaled air comes into the alveolar space with a certain pressure, and then pressure gradients are established. So blood coming into the alveolar capillaries has a partial pressure of oxygen of about 40, and you've got about 104 millimeters of mercury of pressure for oxygen in the alveolar space. So 104 minus 40, you've got a nice pressure gradient. So oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveolar space into the alveolar capillaries. And carbon dioxide will do the opposite. Carbon dioxide has a pressure gradient, allowing carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the alveolar capillaries into the alveolar space, and then you exhale and get rid of the CO2. And then down at the level of the tissue capillaries, that process is opposite. So oxygen will leave the tissue capillaries down its partial pressure gradient into the tissue cells, and carbon dioxide will leave the tissue cells into the tissue capillaries down its carbon dioxide gradient. So there's some terms that are important to know in the respiratory system. There's pulmonary ventilation, that's inhalation and exhalation. So when your thoracic cavity volume increases, you inhale. When your thoracic cavity volume decreases, you exhale. So air is moving down its pressure gradient. There's external respiration, that's gas exchange in the lungs that we just talked about, carbon dioxide and oxygen moving down their partial pressure gradients. And then there's transport of respiratory gases, which we talked about. Oxygen travels with hemoglobin and dissolved in the plasma. Carbon dioxide travels mostly in the plasma, is our chemical formula. CO2 plus H2O gives carbonic acid, that's H2CO3, and then that can dissociate, carbonic acid can dissociate into a free hydrogen ion and bicarbonate HCO3 minus. Then there's internal respiration. That's where you do gas exchange at the level of the cells. So oxygen is diffusing out of the tissue capillaries into the tissue cells, and carbon dioxide is going the opposite direction. And then there's cellular respiration. That happens in the cytoplasm in microorganisms and the mitochondria of eukaryotic cells like we have. And this is the formula for cell respiration. Glucose plus oxygen gives carbon dioxide, water, and 36 ATP. So remember that when you do cell respiration, the point of bringing in oxygen to the level of the tissue cells is so that oxygen can go to the mitochondria and be the final electron acceptor, so you can make a large amount of ATP. And I think that's it.